Right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start and just let everybody kind of filter in as they get here. Hopefully, everybody is warmed up from quite a cold day outside and has had some lunch. Thank you for joining us for this Learning Network webinar. This is the last one of our open webinars before we kind of start just inviting those people that have signed up for the network. So as we go through, if it's something that you think you would like to be part of the network and haven't already signed up, please do. Today, our topic is the animal health considerations around using livestock for managing bracken. This came across quite naturally, really, because as soon as we started doing any work with livestock and bracken, we had started having a lot of questions about the risks around it. So very pleased to welcome our speaker today, who's Alan Murphy from APHA. He's very experienced vet, very knowledgeable, so he's going to hopefully answer all of your questions and give you lots of information around it. We are recording, so you will be able to look back because I think it will be quite a lot of information, but hopefully you'll find it worthwhile. For your questions, please do put them in the Q&A tab. There is an option there, and it should mean that people can vote up questions as well. So if you go into there to put a question in and see somebody's already asked it, you can vote that up as well. The chat is there in case of any issues and stuff. We've got Matilda in the background from Soil Association, making sure everybody can get on and if there's any tech issues. So the agenda for today, fairly simple. I'm going to give a little bit of introduction to the project and how we've got here. It'll be quite brief, and then hand over to Alan. Then we've got an opportunity for you to get all of your questions answered. Any questions we don't get answered today, we will get followed up. Then I'll give a little bit of an update of where we've got to with the Learning Network and what the next steps are. And that's us. So I will move on to my next slide. Apologies, some of you may have seen this slide already. I think we've got quite a lot of people here that are already part of kind of activity, have already signed up to the network. But this is where we started with the livestock stuff. So we're into the third year of this project, which is one of the field labs. I've just noticed that there's a typo on this slide because I've copied it from an old presentation. But it is a field lab, not a filed lab. So this project started a couple of years ago, and it came out of actually a group from Pasture for Life that were part of a FIPL project for all discussing bracken management with each other. And wanting to do a little bit more, and it fitted in perfectly with the Innovative Farmers Field Labs. So we set that away. We had 8 farms involved originally. We've got Robin Pakeman from up at the James Hutton Institute as our researcher and guru in all things bracken. And then myself and then Robin from Pasture for Life have been coordinating this project. So we've got the final year of data collection this year. And the report and things for this project, this particular bit of research, will come out in spring 27. However, that's just because from that pot of funding, we are planning on continuing the research using livestock. I'll cover it a little bit more later on, but the learning network comes with another field lab opportunity, so we can keep going on some of the livestock-based research. This is some of the results from the first 2 years, just to kind of highlight to you that we are seeing that it is having an impact. So these some of the measurements that we've been taking are bracken density and bracken height. And you'll see there that the control for density hasn't changed over the 2 years of the project. But in the management, we saw a 34% reduction in bracken density, where we've been using livestock to manage the site. Similar in height, we saw a little bit difference year on year in the control, just 3.2%, but we saw quite a big reduction in 41.7% in the management site. So even taking away that 3.2, that was for a year on year difference, we're still seeing quite dramatic change, which is great. I've got a couple of videos here. Again, apologies, some of you may have seen them before. This is one of our field lab sites that are using pigs, and they're spreading to encourage the pigs into the bracken areas. They've been spreading some large pig nuts just to get them in there and rooting around. So this was, I think, earlier. This was in the early summer, and then a couple of months later, this is the same site. So Julia, the farmer, is still putting some pig nuts out, but slightly smaller pig nuts, just to keep them going back in. And these pigs have access to quite a big bit of the hill. It's an old deer park, and they're going back into the woodland and stuff when they're not being encouraged out, basically. But you can see there's been quite a drastic reduction in the cover there, and they do a very good job of breaking up the fat. And look happy and healthy. So I think I'll stop sharing there and let you start sharing your screen, Alan.
Thanks, Tubbs.
And then, yeah, and kick off.
All good? Or
Yeah, perfect.
excellent. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invite. It's always a good opportunity for us to have a chat about things that are sort of not necessarily considered to be commonplace, but certainly are out there in terms of people's concerns. As I continue to tell all my Nottingham vet students, it's not always an infectious issue you're going to deal with when you come into practice, and therefore plants and other things are quite often sort of, to some extent, ignored because we have this sort of brave assumption that animals will never actually potentially eat things that aren't good for them. We all know that's actually not the case. God love them, but they will do things to frustrate us at the best of times. So my role as veterinary lead for toxicology, basically all it means is I've got a ridiculous amount of ink on my business card. But the basic premise is I just like to know about things that are potentially, as I say, non-infectious. So we want to know about stuff that's out there. And clearly bracken and various other plants are of substantial level with regards to intake in terms of our sort of natural habitat. And therefore, as we continue to use rewilding and various other things, we need to try and get the message out there that there's always a potential danger. Danger has to be balanced in terms of, yeah, I know the hazard, and therefore what's the risk, and how can I maybe balance that risk up? And as such, therefore, we do have to live within what we have to say is normal systems and actually be quite sensible and quite pragmatic to be aware of it's relevant, but how we maybe take measures to address it and try and avoid problems. Those are things that are sometimes worthwhile just reminding people. And every day is a school day. I think those of us who actually have met the people that think they know it all are clearly not the people to necessarily rely on, because at the end of the day, as we've pointed out, we've got field labs or filed labs as we call them, but we're continually trying to expand our knowledge on these things and trying to learn. And as such, therefore, we're always open-minded to additional questions and discussions. So when we discuss the fact that my role is basically looking at dangerous plants, there's lots of dangerous plants out there. Any Harry Potter fans may recognise this as Alnwick Castle. Now, Alnwick Castle's got a lovely collection of about 100 different things that have got all sorts of nasty stuff in them. And we probably need to be conscious that we embrace wildlife, but we also embrace nature and fauna. And as we continue to put animals in those type of environments, it's kind of important to realize, well, okay, there's a toxin there possibly, but this is a 600-kilo beast. Is that likely to be a problem for it? Or is it something a bit smaller than that? Could that impact age, type of animal? All relevant factors in terms of what we know. So with that aspect, it's quite important for me to actually be aware of what potential toxic agents are out in the world. And there's a lot of them. When you consider we move on from infections and look at all the potential things that we could potentially expose our animals to, not only we've got flooding, given the fact we've all seen a deluge from the heavens over the past couple of weeks and months, it's actually, I think there's an awful lot more risk coming from that. But in addition to that, there's all sorts of things out there in terms of volcanoes, fires. They all potentially expose animals that are outdoors. And therefore, it's my role is actually to try and give people some salient advice as to what to do, how to maybe avoid any risks, and most importantly, make sure the end product, i.e. be that milk, eggs, or meat, is safe to go into the food chain. That's primarily why we're here. At the end of the day, most of us are in an industry, we're trying to produce a finished product. It's our responsibility to make sure it's fit and safe and healthy. Ergo, we want to try and minimize any potential impacts on the production system. With that, we want to make sure animals are on a good diet, healthy. It might not be perfect, but then realistically, you're talking to Scotsmen, we have no understanding of what a perfect diet is. So therefore, we just try and do what we can with some circumstances that we're left with, be that sweets or sweets. So a little bit of the concept of what plant poisonings are. It's realistically the basis of it's in the plant already. It's not doing the plant any harm. So whilst we get quite giddy and think the plant's at fault here, it's not. Those metabolites, those compounds in that plant are there to actually protect it in many circumstances, to avoid fundamentally being grazed by herbivores in some cases. But in other situations, it's not there as an actual toxic agent in any way. But what happens is when our ruminants digest it, or our pigs or other species digest it, they take something in, which is either activated or changed or metabolized into something else that becomes a problem. And that's what we're really dealing with. Now, There are an array of different plants out there, and there's lots of different things. But our remit's to try and get a bit more of an understanding for that. Now, apps are available on phones nowadays, so whilst I know we're focusing on Bracken today, it's just to make sure people are conscious of the fact that we can quite often find lots of different plants. And obviously, as we change in terms of horticulture, and I know we're looking at Bracken in this case, but we've seen issues with herbal lays and other things, etc., where people have gone in with an assumption that it's going to be this type of plant, it's going to be this type of growth rate, it's going to be this level of coverage. They can sometimes alter on that. So you can get these apps on your phone, and it'll tell you what the plant is, give you a bit of a steer, links into different websites, and tells you what to do. So they're quite useful things to have on your phone, even for those of us who just want to do a bit of a flora and fauna exercise, so not just beyond butterflies and bird calls, but there's other stuff out there as well. So there's always an educational tool out there. And if you're like myself and completely cat-candid when it comes to using phones, find a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old in my case, it'll tell you how to put it on, and it works very effectively at that point. But I know today is the focus on Bracken, and there's lots out there. Diagnosis of plant poisonings or plant problems, very challenging. End of the day, it's found at the scene, or maybe not, because the animal may well have consumed it all. Clinical changes in the beast, well, that might not actually be that easy to do, and animals have an inherent ability to try and stay alive and well until the point we decide to give up, and then it's down the precipice of death. Postmortems are useful, but not always that practical, especially out in the middle of Scottish Highlands. And you think, well, could have been Bracken that's caused the problem. Well, maybe having some basic ideas to what could be seen if you opened it up, especially on a Saturday afternoon when no one else is available to do it, that might help. So in this presentation, there are a few post-mortem images. So just to keep people aware of the fact, in case they've had a heavy lunch and don't want to re-see it again, just to be conscious, they're not that grim. But at the end of the day, we're talking about Bracken toxicity here. So I do need to make sure you're looking at the pictures that will actually present it. We'll give you another warning just before we get there. So Bracken's the situation we're dealing with. Now we're looking at all species in terms of what potential issues. Now I know that cattle, sheep, and we've obviously seen the pictures of the mangalitses looking around, and pigs are in there as well. But don't forget ponies are in there as well, goats, dogs. Everything's got an ability to eat something that shouldn't agree with it or sometimes graze on things. I haven't put a picture of humans in there, but in the good old days in Scotland, we used to eat bracken on a regular basis when times were hard, in World War I. Creates a sort of a really starchy base to it, but it was used for bread making and various other things. Not very healthy and not very sensible. And certainly now in certain cultures, as you go further across the world, a lot of people still eat them in terms of it's seen as a sort of flavoursome, topical, shall we say, popular little diet, like a treat. Bracken has some nasty things in it, and you just need to be very conscious that's not necessarily the best thing to do. Cultures are cultures. We're never going to necessarily change them. You're never going to get Scotsmen to deny haggis is the best thing ever since sliced bread, even though you look at the ingredients of it and think, what the hell? But it's what we do. So realistically, in terms of looking at Bracken, first of all, there's actually a few types. Within the UK, we've got sort of predominantly Pediria maculinum, but within that, we've also got a few others that are found in other areas, etc. Certainly in Scotland and Wales, etc. There's a little bit more of a change around. Those species can have variations in terms of the amount of toxin that they contain. So therefore, there's always a little bit of variation. However, we would never say to you, oh, that's such and such a plant, the risk is this, or the risk is that. That's a little bit of a brave step and a brave decision to make. So we would never give you that kind of advice. Our premise is to try and make sure you're aware of the fact that bracken is a ubiquitous plant. It's everywhere within the world, etc. Considered the most popular, one of the most popular weeds. I think that's a bit of a statement. It can be a problem plant, but it has a lot of useful functions as well. At the end of the day, it's there to maybe does reduce biodiversity, but it also has other functions to it as well. So we want to make sure that whilst we're not looking to completely obliterate it, we want to manage it to the best of our devices within reason as to what we can do and what we can't do. The challenging aspect is, as it comes to the potential for exposure, how we get rid of it not using chemical methods, is that we hope some animals are going to eat it. Not necessarily hope for large amounts of it, but they will eat it. Certainly, when you see the pigs ploughing through it, you think they must be consuming quite a lot, and they do. When we open those ones up that have died from conditions we'll cover in a bit, you'll see as to what volume of actually they will get through is quite a lot. And pigs are quite consumptive little creatures. They will eat quite a bit of it. And the vast majority don't show any problems whatsoever, but you will get the odd niggle. And those toxins that are in there, they're quite broad. We've actually done these studies over the years, etc. You think, well, actually, it could be this, could be that. The two main ones, really, from the presentations that we see in livestock, are toxicology and thiaminases. Now, they have different presentations depending on what kind of species you're looking at. Toxicology is a problem for everybody. Don't assume it's just a ruminant thing. Once it actually gets all the press for ruminants in terms of the potential for diseases that it causes, it can actually be found in what we call the monogastrics, the horses, the pigs, etc. And it also can be a problem for humans as well. So whilst we don't necessarily see an awful lot of bracken products out there being utilised nowadays, It is a problem with the fact that could it be an animal that's been provided bracken and it then transfers it to qualicide into the products from that animal? Milk, meat, those are the two primaries we're looking at. That's why there are some food safety obligations with regards to animals that have been exposed to bracken or have been raised and reared on bracken. We do have to make sure those are sort of messages that are quite well established and quite clear cut. I get the pasture for life. I get the whole premise of what we're trying to make sure is we utilize the environment to the best that we can to maximize what we can actually get from it without additional carbon footprint work. We need to do that, but we also need to be conscious that there's a degree of risk there that we need to just be a little bit aware of and just make sure people are conscious of the fact that that risk doesn't want to be transferred down into further into the food chain. Other products that are in there, camphorol, shikimic acid, tannins. We've seen tannins in abundance this year with acorns. So again, every plant can have a variety of different things. And as individual creatures, much like people listening are individual as well, you can all have variable sensitivities. So one person's poison is another person's meat, quite literally in these cases. So the toxic doses are not always set in stone, and the toxic effect is certainly not set in stone either. So these compounds can have quite variable effects. Prunicins will quite often present just a cyanide toxicity. So actually you open them up and just all you can smell is raw almonds. And again, that can be certain plants that have just managed to create an awful lot, certain strains, and you won't find an awful lot in the animal itself when it comes to the post-mortem findings or cause of death, which invariably is quite often sudden. The other ones, the qualicides, thiaminases, qualicide certainly is more of a sort of chronic issue in terms of what we see. And I say chronic, when it comes to death, death is always sudden because at the end of the day, you've stopped your heart, your brain stopped oxygen supply, you're ended off. How long it takes you to get there can sometimes be a bit problematic in terms of timing. So don't always assume that it's been a peracute death just because you've not seen it for a couple of days. It might have been dying from the minute you didn't actually, the last time you set eyes upon it, and now it's got to that stage now. So qualicides are more of a chronic effect, but we will see deaths in animals, usually for a period of 1 to 2 weeks, just with that exposure, but they can all be variable in terms of keeping themselves going until they decide enough's enough. So in terms of the actual aspects of what we look at, the one little bit down the bottom here, the fiddleheads, the crow's ears, they're the bits that are still popular in certain cultures for eating for humans, and they're also the ones that contain the most toxins. So from our perspective, that's the ones we get worried about in terms of when you see animals and digesting them in. The bulk of the stuff, ferns and blades, etc. Yeah, that's all got toxin in it, but the concentrated format's down there. So there are risks that alter a little bit when it comes to certain times of the year, which we know with regards to bracken, and certain levels of coverage as well in terms of plant growth, etc. We haven't mentioned spores in this as well. Now, spores obviously contain toxins as well. Now, for those people out working in bracken, you've got to be conscious that whilst you may be sort of using whatever means to try and flatten it down or whatever, spores are generated at that point as well. So there's qualicide exposure can come from a different number of ways, etc. Not only have you got an ingestion of it, but it's going to be a very solvent compound as well. So you can actually find it in water courses. So we test for it before everybody runs off and panics. We do want to make sure there's no issues or exposure routes for potential human issues. And so far, we've not found any potential problems apart from the risk posed by people who eat the crow's ears as we speak. So what happens in some species? Well, the monogastrics, as we like to call them, the pigs are the ones that we're really focusing on here. It's the thiaminases that do the bulk of the damage. That thiamine knocks out your vitamin B1. Now, the loss of vitamin B1 basically affects cell metabolism. And unfortunately, the two key areas of cells that it actually affects are actually the nervous system and the heart. So what happens is certainly in some species, you like to see maybe nervous signs. Now you go out and look at animals and think, well, is it nervous? Is it not nervous? Is it showing problems? Horses seem to be quite nuanced in that they show what we call Bracken staggers. Now, for those with livestock, certainly cattle, you'll understand that staggers is quite often presented with low calciums, low magnesium. The animal seems quite unsteady. It's the same in these cases, but what's happening is the myelin that encloses your nerve cells isn't complete. And as such, therefore, the signals that go down into this further nerves down the system in terms of your motor neurons, etc., they don't fire effectively. So you end up getting the mixed signals, and as such, all of a sudden your coordination goes slightly off. In pigs, we quite often find that whilst in coordination might be a problem, might not be a problem, it's quite not always that easy to see, especially in your areas like this, because you've not got vast areas to run them on. You're not sort of like 100-meter sprint areas to say, right, off you go and let's see what your movement's like. They're usually shuffling around anyway. But they quite often will present maybe a few respiratory symptoms. And that's not because the lungs are affected directly, it's because your heart's going. And what happens is they start to do a bit of heart damage. The myocardial cells, the muscle cells that pump your heart, they start to get challenged. And as such, you start to go into congestive cardiac failure. Now, for a pig, if you're not listening to that pig with a stethoscope, you're not putting an ECG on it minute by minute, you will have no idea. And the pig will seem to grow quite happily, which it will do, but quite often they'll just be found as dead because that's pretty much the presentation of them. And that is the two primary problems that we see primarily in terms of the species that we've got out there from the monogastric basis. Pigs, the thiaminase tends to hit the heart, so we tend to see them get basically just found dead with cardiac failure. Horses, more of an issue with regards to the nervous system, simply because you're not pushing them hard. However, if you push a pony quite hard in terms of expectations for exercise, etc., the myocardial factor will play up, but we will tend to see them sort of maybe start to struggle a little bit and shortness of breath. The bracken, as I say, all really comes from those rhizomes and young leaves. It's a case of the fact, certainly with pigs, you've got a demonstrable rooting behaviour. Now, that varies depending on the pig species as well. Some are really good at dug in and actually want to make an awful effort. Some are a bit more lazy and actually think, oh, I've dug a couple of inches and not really bothered. So again, it's all dependent on what kind of pig species and breed you've got out there that'll make the difference in just how much they take in. As with all things, depending on how much you eat, when you eat it, it'll actually affect just how much you've actually taken in. And therefore, within that, you've also got the variation within the toxin as well as to how much it's going to affect you, how much it doesn't affect you. The most recent case I had was a few pigs on a woodland area that were being used to clear woodland so they could replant seeds, trees of a more effective, shall we say, commercial value. But they had 3 dead pigs space of over a period of about 2 weeks, and they all were sort of doing very well, growing well, but again, all dropped dead with cardiac failure. When you opened them up, the pathology was quite striking, quite evident. But with those, it's all the lack of vitamin B1. So it's having that awareness of saying, well, actually, if I've got them in that environment, what do I need to supplement them with? You can either supplement with feed, you can supplement with injections, as we'll look at, but it's a case of being conscious of that risk that you put them into. When it comes to pig poisonings, bracken's the most popular. When it comes to clinical signs, you can see on there, found dead is pretty much the main one, even though these pigs are looked at on a fairly regular basis, and you would have a nuanced idea that not looking so well today, or it's a bit slow, it's not taking its feed so much. They're all quite evident changes that are there, but most of these are just found dead. And as I say, when we open them up, the pathology is quite striking, which is the next slide, to those who want to be, shall we say, a little bit aware of the gruesome images. They're not that gruesome, by the way. But this is a challenge we see. And you look at, well, we see coal tar as well. Now, that's not that common an event in the middle of a field covered in bracken, but might be if you bring them in somewhere and haven't thought about the fact that pigs will dig and they will find road planings and all sorts. Hence why we see coal tar issues as well. So bracken toxicity, it's potentially on the rise, but then again, how many do we get presented with? Because invariably we're looking at these as smaller units. We're not looking at vast herd sizes where, yes, the potential economic impact was substantial given the fact it's 1 or 2 animals, but if it's part of a commercial industry, and certainly this was the case with the forestry aspect I was dealing with, it, those pigs are put in there for a purpose. When they died, they're going, okay, well, I've not got the pig value at the end of the day, but they've done a blooming good job of getting rid of all the bracken that I wanted them to do. So is that the end? And there is that argument, well, you can't put them into environments that are risk unless you maybe taking some measures to address it. Now, that's all we would say at the end of the day. If you know you're putting them into an environment which has got potential toxins, potential risks to it, just make some measures to actually try and offset that in terms of controls and bits and pieces. And this is what we tend to find in pigs. Cardiac failure. Liver's quite enlarged, kidneys are quite pushed up in terms of size as well. Usually an awful lot of fluid sat in there, and that's related to your cardiac dysfunction. That's when you see people that have got cardiac disease, quite often they say, I've got a fluid buildup, and that's all it is. Your vessels become leaky, your heart's not pumping as hard, and as such, therefore, you tend to eventually get to a precipice point where your heart just says, can't cope anymore, and you either develop more extreme symptoms, or, as in the case of pigs, you're commonly just found dead. Respiratory, as I say, might be in there, but very, very rarely. And the same with neurological symptoms as well. They're just fairly non-specific. And again, with the other chemicals in there, the shimic acids, the tequalicides, etc., they might affect other areas of the gut, particularly stomach. And quite often you might see non-specific signs, maybe not doing so well, maybe losing a bit of weight. In those ones, what you'll actually have is quite often is ulcers established because that tequalicide actually does some damage to the tissue cells, etc., lining the stomach or further down the intestine. Usually not so far down the intestine, it usually likes altered pHs, but it can actually impact quite heavily on your stomach, so you end up with ulcers, etc. as well. So again, these pigs can have a bit of pathology that's in other locations, which is not as common, but still indicative of the fact that you say, well, what are you feeding them on? They're used to clear bracken. Okay, well, that makes sense. So what have you done to avoid it? Well, in those circumstances, it's a case of saying thiamine supplementation. You need to look at saying, right, how do we get thiamine into them? Well, you could put it into the feed if you're still feeding them. But remember, depending on the weight of the pig, you might need to do that as an incremental rate. certainly from the point of view of metabolizable energy and all the rest of it, you probably do want to get them up to a certain amount of feed that they start maybe at sort of putting them in at certain weights, etc. But those weights will change quite rapidly. Being pigs, they grow well, they feed on put into them quite quickly, so they will raise. So you need to maybe alter the B1 levels that you give them. But in addition to that, consider if there's any other supplementations you might need to give. Invariably, pigs are quite hard and quite tough and robust. They will find all they need from the environment. But in this case, they're finding something else in that environment which actually knocks out something they do critically need, the B1. So it's worthwhile looking at thiamine supplementation. Minerals and nutritionists, people will be far more effective at giving you the right doses and costs and benefits of what to do and when to do it. But the other aspect is also remember what's the end stage for those pigs. Are we planning to put them into the food chain? Or are they planning to be home consumption? Because that's the other thing we have to consider with these ones. Quite often, the home consumption aspect is quite a popular route for these. But all of a sudden, you've altered your status because you've now become a very, very small subset of the population that's getting exposed to something. Ergo, why we always stipulate to you, at least keep them out for 15 days. And that takes them off the bracket. So take them somewhere else. Now, that might be quite challenging, but if they've actually cleared a bit of ground on the bracken, you can actually put up some fencing, albeit good luck with the fencing, because unless it's built at Fort Knox, my experience of pigs that they will go where they want to go, but you can do your best with that. But you need to minimize, eliminate the bracken exposure, because if they've still got that taqualicide in there, and then it goes for slaughter, then you put it through and you've actually got meat residues in there, and you become the only population to eat that pig, be it sausages, meat, whatever, for the next couple of months, you will expose yourself to more taqualicide than you want. Now, that's not necessarily going to do you wholesale problems and harm, but it is a case of being aware that you're potentially increasing a risk. Now, we don't want to be risk averse, otherwise we wouldn't get anywhere because we would never drive a car, we'd never get out of bed. But you need to be conscious of the fact that what risk means to you, and therefore maybe just be conscious of that. As I say, if you actually even identified it as a pig that's breathing heavy, could it be thiamine? It could be, but there's other options out there for pigs as well. It's not one disease fits all. There could be other potential diseases going on, but consider thiamine as an option and maybe think about maybe doing some treatment with it. What about ruminants? Well, what do? Well, as I say, they tend to go down more the line of sort of a couple of things because cattle and sheep are, shall we say, a bit more talented in terms of means of death. They like to think of being a bit more imaginative in terms of not just some one thing straightforward. So they'll give you a few different things. First one's the acute hemorrhage. Taqualicide in its own right actually changes when it's ingested, and it actually creates something which is considered to be mutagenic and carcinogenic. Therefore, it does some serious damage. And what actually happens is it goes to your bone marrow and starts to push down on it and actually reduces your ability for your bone marrow to work. So quite often what happens is these animals end up with acute, effectively looks like leukemia. Basically, your blood cells just disappear and you end up going into a substantive amount of vulnerability with diseases. You obviously have lost all your white cells. You've got no ability to fight infections off. Your red cells are there to get oxygen around your system. That doesn't work anymore. And these animals invariably are found deads. If you go long term with it, and we're talking certainly in my experience of the good old days of cows up in Scottish Highlands, etc., eating bracken for dinner, breakfast, and lunch, they go for years with it. And they can cope with it once they get over the initial challenge of it. They sort of have a bit of a tolerance factor, but eventually those sort of carcinogenic effects start to spread elsewhere. And the first one is usually the bladder. And you end up with what they call enzootic hematuria, where your bladder gets quite changed, quite marked thickening, and you end up with a lot of blood clots coming out. You know, red water, yeah, it could be babesia, which we're going to cover in a bit. But again, there's other things in there as well. But because the qualicide compound actually likes pHs a little bit higher, so what you would find above the intestinal tract, what it'll quite often do is cause problems in tumours further up this intestinal tract. So usually what we call oral tumours, esophageal tumours, and rumen tumours, what we call upper alimentary tract squamous cell carcinoma, and these are aggressive. They take years to develop. So realistically, unless you've got these girls out there for years, the likelihood of it is low. But there is still a likelihood of it if that's the predominant material they're eating. Ergo, why when we're looking at these management systems, we do need to look at foddering. We do need to look at systems whereby we're not necessarily eliminating and minimizing the risk, but we need to be conscious that we don't want them eating it as a staple diet as the only thing. Not that all will. But some animals are quite tricky. Some animals actually think, I quite like the taste of this, and that'll be their preferential choice. Now, with those ones, if you observe them, then maybe there's measures to say, well, actually, maybe we don't want to have that animal around long term, because maybe its risk is actually increased, and maybe we want to try and avoid that. And again, it's really more the practical measures of how you work it and how you can't work it, and those really work on the cows themselves. The hemorrhage is quite marked in terms of what you actually find within the carcass, and we'll show you a couple of pictures of that. Sheep, slightly different. They can get it, as I say, in terms of the acute hemorrhage, but they also get bright blindness. Again, the variations of where these things go. No toxin's ever the same in terms of where it delivers into different bodies and different species, etc. So in sheep, what you'll quite often find is that it actually gets into the eyes and damages the cells at the back of your eyes, which are there to sort of help you sort of absorb colour, light, etc. So when you look at these guys, they actually have a really hyper-reflective tapetum. So when you actually shine a light on them, it just bounces straight back on you like another torchlight. So again, usually a chronic situation. We're talking months and months for this to actually happen. But depending on the amount it eats, it could be a potential risk. Tumours do occur in sheep, but realistically, the lifespan of a sheep is unfortunately not as long as any sort of cow per se. We tend to sort of get as much out of a cow as we can. Sheep teeth tend to go in everything else, as you all know. So therefore, they tend to go down the road reasonable time period. So the likelihood of actual tumour development, a lot less. Goats, law unto themselves, they seem to be more resistant. That doesn't mean they're completely immune to the effects, but they do seem to cope with it a little bit better. So good luck to them. And that's what it looks like in terms of these sheep. It's basically just the eyes just become quite blank and quite unresponsive. And these are the pictures you're going to see in them. So this is the sort of hemorrhage that we'll find in these. And these are quite common in animals under about a year old that have been put onto Bracken for the first time and just never seen it before. But in addition to that, you quite often find hemorrhages everywhere else. So the guts are usually hemorrhages, and these are effectively not quite like black pudding, but you've got a lot of blood in there. When you open up the intestinal wall, you can see all the hemorrhages on the surface of the wall, etc. as well. And that's not an uncommon finding in animals that have died from acute hemorrhagic sort of myelopathy, again due to Bracken. The interesting thing with these is that whilst we've all seen blue tongue rampaging through the country per se in terms of its spread, albeit maybe the clinical impact hasn't been manifested fully in some situations, these would be a potential for blue tongue differential as well. So again, it's just the fact that a lot of these diseases do cross over, but these have got all the linkage to say, Bracken links in with this, and in addition to that, wrong time of year for vectors, etc., etc. And so in the middle of the hillside, it's probably -2 degrees and a strong wind, so likelihood of a midge even being able to survive out there pretty low. And the chronic ones are like this, where you see these tumours developing in the bowel, in the bladder, I should say. Now, we don't see many of those at all nowadays, simply because we don't tend to get many 13, 14-year-old cows brought in from the Scottish hills. In addition to that, there's not that many of those cows about, but it is a common problem. But again, who's to say it's not going to appear in young animals that are fed lots of bracken? So it's just something to be conscious of as a problem. Now, as I said before, it's qualicide's the main proxin here in terms of what it does, but it will affect ruminants, but predominantly it'll also get into non-ruminants as well. So you will see these tumours over time, if time permits. So again, with that, it's the case of saying these animals have got quite a quick turnover, so the likelihood is less. But you also got humans. As I say, be aware of the fact that this compound, it quite often gets around, and it does cause issues, especially in food-producing animals. You need to be very conscious that food-producing animals will potentially carry over a level into the products that they're being produced. So again, with all these things, we always try and keep the level of human exposure low, but if people decide to go out and harvest bracken and eat the rhizomes or the sort of croziers because they think they're quite tasty, on their own head be it. But at the end of the day, common sense is quite important when it comes to these things. There are set withdrawals out there, 15 days for meat, 4 days for milk. The COT, which is the Committee of Toxicity, has basically done lots of analysis on this. We consider the risk to be fairly low to humans, even though we can find it in watercourses, etc. The level is so low, it's not a problem. But it is something to be conscious of from a sort of potential of what we're doing from the environment. And also, if we're putting these animals into that area, we just need to make sure that we're abiding by what is legislative rules in terms of what we do for withdrawals. So in terms of bracken, that's pretty much it in terms of what the disease implications are. But we know bracken doesn't come on its own. It tends to come with lots of little friends. Look at these things. So I thought it was important just for the fact that we are continually reminded and continually highlighted is that ticks are on the rise. They are not getting any less, and they're coming with more and more problems, shall we say. So I thought it was pertinent to maybe just go a few slides over in terms of what else is out there in terms of ticks. Our predominant species is Ixodes, so realistically we know, there's a few other species on the coastal areas, etc., but realistically we want to focus on Ixodes as being the primary wishes. As I say, there are 20 other species, give or take. Life cycle is always very much dependent on climate and all the rest of it type stuff, but we know climate change is markedly changing, etc. We're seeing ticks now in January in the middle of Dartmoor, etc. So these guys are not abiding by what we consider to be the rule, but then I don't think I've ever met a tick that's actually literate and can read a book, so they don't really care what they want to do. They want to evolve. They want to do different things. You've also got multiple wildlife species involved in terms of the spread and movement, and I don't think anyone's any denial with the fact that deer populations are expanding and they're moving. We've got maize crops everywhere. Perfect cover for a deer to move during the day. So again, these things are all changing in terms of the ecology and how we work with these things. And the diseases are out there. We know when it comes to the diseases, there's pretty much the primary four we're interested in. It's tick-borne fever, Again, anaplasma, quite common. Sheep and cattle are the primary one, but it goes into every species that decides to jump around in. Tick pyemia tends to be a sheep issue. In terms of what we're looking at, ticks biting, you get a bit of local infection, usually staphylococcus, and they become quite sick. But that bacteria can go into bacteremia, septicemia, and they will die. Louping ill is a major one in terms of it's a significant issue for people and also for other species as well. So as much as sheep and cattle are primarily the sort of factories of it, shall we say, we know it goes everywhere for the people on green bird sites, etc. Grouse, you've got goats, pigs, llamas, alpaca, you name it, they're out there. So in terms of risks, that's a significant one. We've seen it in dogs recently. We've seen it in cows recently. So whilst these diseases are always considered to be, that's a sheep problem, it's not anymore because it doesn't abide by the rules. And more important, it doesn't need to abide by the rules. And then you've got bovine babesiosis, so the sort of red water situations. Now, I know that maybe fits with the fact that we just looked at hemorrhages and bits and pieces, but we do need to be aware that's another condition as well. So what's going on? Well, the old age aspect of, well, it grows at this time of year, doesn't really see many ticks, doesn't abide anymore. We're seeing more and more. We can see this local spread. We get hot times of the year when we get the disease spreading in terms of actual animals, but that's really reflective when they're at grass, when they're exposed. Those ones that are actually at the periphery of this are really animals that have either been identified on blood sampling as an incidental look-see, shall we say, or maybe suggest maybe early turnout, but we know that's probably not likely. The vast majority of people still look, well, I need grass to feed them, so what's the point in putting them out? Ergo, we won't really see significant tick diseases until there's a substantial population out at the actual grazing area. But we're looking at putting our animals out all year round with this Bracken system, plenty of coverage, quite warm, quite cosy. So do we potentially need to consider these diseases all year round? Yes, we do, because the ticks are certainly doing that. So why shouldn't we? Then you got the clinical signs. Well, anaplasma is more of a sort of like open door type disease. Bacteria, so rickettsia, basically just allows you to go and do all sorts of things. As a bacteria, it basically just makes you feel poorly, knocks out a few white cells, and it opens the door for other things. You look at the clinical signs, I mean, hell, that could be anything. Fevers, respiratory symptoms. Everything breathes fast when it's got a temperature. Doesn't mean it's got any pulmonary problems. It just means it's breathing fast to sort out its heat regulation. That's what ruminants do. No protection from colostrum. So end of the day, you think, well, what do we do with these guys? Is it really going to be an immune system response? Is it not immune system response? Do we get them out? Do we get them exposed to it? It goes if you not get regular exposure, your immune system's not that good. So there are challenges with it. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, we found it. Does it mean anything? You think, well, it possibly means there was a doorway in at that point, but if nothing else, it indicates you've got ticks. So therefore, should we be conscious of the fact what else might come from that problem? Timing of lamb exposure, well, realistically, it's always been proposed to try and get them sort of under 2 weeks of age, no dramas. Everybody will be quite happy. But over that age, think, well, what is the timing? Well, Tuck was late going in this year, Tuck was early going in this year, with a better conception rate, a poorer conception rate. All these things change the dynamics. So in terms of that actual risk period, it's an ongoing permanent shift, farm per farm, field by field in some situations in terms of what risks you've got. So we do need a bit of a sort of, fairly say, regular dynamic assessment of this. Then you've got the actual potential signs of what we see. They're always on the rise and they're not getting any less. In terms of you look at the numbers here, it's just continually ongoing. Now that's better methodologies, it's better diagnostic tools, but it still indicates it's on the rise. It still indicates it's more of an issue in terms of a doorway for other infections and other problems. So just be conscious of that as a risk factor. What does it do? Well, in terms of babesiosis, which is the other one we're quite keen on, causes hemolysis. Now, we've already covered the fact that Bracken can do that in its own right. So unless you've actually got hands on that beast and you're looking to see, well, has it got many ticks on it? You could have thought, well, maybe it was acute myelopathy due to Bracken. But if it's loaded with ticks, it could also be red water as well due to babesia. So it's a case of getting out there. In the good old days, we used to do a red cell smear, basically a blood smear, trying to identify it. We've now got to molecular methods far more effective and far more sensitive. So we're conscious of the fact that we're able to diagnose it a lot more effectively. But then you've got to look at treatments, resistance. What do we do with treatment? Treatment's a nightmare to try and put into place. Imazole, massive withdrawal period. So therefore, quite a lot of people trying to, how do we manage them? How do we get them into to become effectively the innate immunity? How do we cope with it as a sort of population? And that does work. But at the end of the day, you've always got the fact that, well, yeah, but the ticks can move. They can take it somewhere else. The deer can take it potentially somewhere else, mechanical, if nothing else. So we need to maybe make measures to try and control it a bit more effectively. Post-exposure, immunity can wane. And again, over that several years, if you're not boosting it, you will be more susceptible. So never assume that, well, we've got rid of all the ticks or we've done significant Bracken management, it'll be okay. Well, if another population of ticks arrives and your animals haven't seen it for a while, there will be a problem with it. It can hang on in animals for a long time as well. It can be sitting in there for a couple of years without actually causing any potential issues to the beast, but actually it still acts as a factory, shall we say, of babesia. And then when it comes to the actual infection, again, it can hang around the ticks for quite a long time as well. So if you're coming on to, oh, there's not been any stock on here for years, don't assume the ticks have not actually been tiding along quite happily with babesia inside them. That's now going to give you a new outbreak on your animals as you bring them in. And these are the areas we've got it now. That's today's map. Next week's map might be slightly different depending on when the next molecular tests come in and who actually reports it. Are we seeing it? Are we getting it diagnosed? Do people just assume that's just a bit of red water, I won't bother with it? We do need to actually make sure those diagnoses are in there so the bigger picture is always maintained. Louping is the one we're going to finish on, just for the fact that it's a flavivirus, it's quite a nasty virus, and we're seeing problems, and certainly the animals that get it, it's catastrophic. At the end of the day, the mortality figures are huge in terms of animals that get it. Usually just post-weaning is when they're most susceptible, but it doesn't mean they're not susceptible at other stages of life beyond sort of the wean stage. So again, it's that when you see it, when you don't see it. But we're seeing this now in other species as well. There used to be a vaccine. The vaccine was taken off the marketplace just because there's not enough popularity for it. But we see it devastating huge swathes of crops, both in birds, but also in lambs as well. So we need people to be more conscious of it as a disease and also take more responsibility for it. Everybody's out there walking. Everybody wants to follow the Ben Shepherd sort of approach of getting your legs out, show your shorts, and get out there and get tick bites. It's not a sign of being cool having a big red bullet mark on your leg. Lyme disease, all these conditions are out there that are into humans as well. And as such, people need to be conscious. So we are trying to do our bit. We're trying to get people aware that louping ill's there. Yeah, you get infection to it, you get immunity. If you're lucky and you survive, you're fine. But the losses that can actually happen to a naive population are phenomenal. And the risk of it jumping across to being what they call true zoonotics is there. Even when you're doing PMs on these things, you've got to be conscious of the fact it's about. So what do we do about it? Well, louping ill's everywhere in terms of the West Coast, but we know it's expanding because deer are moving everywhere. Other species are moving everywhere. So we try to get on top of it in terms of certainly Tabitha and I are both members of the Morden. So from that perspective, we're now hopefully launching a next stage of getting the vaccine back out there. So if nothing else, it's to say to you, look, bracken poisoning, well known. Bracken management, you guys are doing fantastic work in making sure that we can have an integrated system looking at different methodologies to control it. Just be conscious there are problems with bracken that will never go away because it's the plant itself will contain a variety of toxins, and animals are always animals. They will eat either too much, too little, but more importantly, they'll eat it maybe at the wrong time and the wrong volume and therefore potentially expose themselves. So we need to be conscious to how we manage that, and the fact that as animals are, at the end of the day, it's got toxins in it that are potential problems for us as well. So we need to make sure we're addressing the issues of food safety from that perspective. But beyond that, bracken isn't a medium, it's an environment that contains other things. And one of the principal things of concern it contains are ticks and all the diseases that come with. So again, just be conscious that it's a whole ecosystem we're trying to control here with the bracken. And yeah, carry on the good work, I would say, but just keep us posted in terms of disease incidents because we're quite interested to know what goes on. So that's pretty much me. Thank you very much for your time and happy to answer questions.
Sorry, thank you, Alan. That's been super interesting. That's really good. We have had a couple of questions come through. A reminder to everybody on the call, if you do think of a question, please do type it into the Q&A. I am aware that was quite a lot of information, so it might be a case that you get a question later. If that happens, do send it over to us. We're producing a bit of a frequently asked questions document that will sit within on the website for people to go and look at, so we will feed in kind of questions and answers into there. So do always send them over if you have them. So the ones that we've got so far, Alan, this one from Hamish: how far away are we from having a louping ill vaccine? I know Beth Wells from Morden has developed the vaccine, but it's finding it prohibitively expensive. So it's a mouthful. I don't know. You can update on this. I feel like.
All I know is that Beth's telling me at the end of the day, the drivers are there to get the money in. It's doing a lot of funding exercises, so we're doing our best to get there. We're on to the next stage, and at the end of the day, to some extent, is a case of, I think Morden are doing it in a very savvy manner. They're looking to try and share it, so it's not a case of one person has to take control of the whole process. So like any of these things, it's a case of trying to put a niche vaccine onto a marketplace, which is quite challenging because unless it's got popular demand from a large commercial environment, we need to do it in a more simplistic and sort of pragmatic way. So it's working and it's getting there, but the concept's great. The vaccine is very effective. but we're still working way through it. But then if you look at how we got through COVID and got COVID vaccines out quite quickly in terms of mechanisms and technology, we're embracing that tech and utilising it to the best of our abilities. So it will happen. It won't happen tomorrow, but it will eventually get on the marketplace. So we're getting there. But to be honest with Hamish, I couldn't give you a definitive time, and Beth would kick me if I did. So
Yes, we don't want to put a timeline on Beth.
no.
But
not really.
as Alan's alluded to, it's being developed in a very different way to how vaccines have been previously, because although the spread of louping illness, you've mentioned, it's been seen in Devon and Cornwall as well, is increasing. It's still quite a small marketplace, and it is kind of the UK sheepcock in specific areas. So there's not that necessarily that big commercial outlook. We're finding even with a lot of the common sheep vaccines that commercially it's sometimes a bit of a loss for the businesses. So it is a bit of a battle from that point of view. But the funding, they've broken it down into phases, and even within those phases, as soon as they hit some of their marks, they can develop a little bit further. So it is constantly developing. It's not one of these things that they have to wait until they get all of the money. It's stuff is happening all of the time. And there's some really good collaborations and stuff going on there. So if anybody's interested in it, do have a look on the Morden website. I believe you can still donate as well. Or if you know any big estates and stuff that have issues with it and stuff, I think they've all been involved in conversations around it. Great. So the next question, actually, is another one from Hamish. Is the incidence of Lyme disease in humans rising, and how many cases are the NHS treating on an annual basis? Something you know?
Lyme disease is certainly on the rise. There's been quite a lot of work done on it in terms of actually NHS, UKHSA's data. Don't know. I don't think they would actually necessarily publish it due to GDPR data and all the rest of it. But a little bit like louping ill, there's a significant push with Lyme disease given celebrities get it, and that might seem a bit dark, but quite often whatever means you can find to promote the significance of a disease does help. And Lyme disease, it's a significant issue in America as well. So again, there's that push forward of those things. In terms of the data we have, we know it's on the rise, but in terms of actual numbers, I don't think they're defined. Caroline Millins at Liverpool's done a lot of work on this, on the islands, etc., looking at Lyme disease incidences. I think there's a lot of data out there, but in terms of actual specific numbers, we don't know. And that's also based on the fact of how many people actually go to the doctors to get it diagnosed versus how many people think they just got a bit of aches and it's a bit of the flu and take some painkillers and then resolve the infection themselves. So there's always a lot of unknowns. So it's very much the tip of what actually is probably actually truly infectious. Do we actually get made aware of? But without the basics of it, it's certainly on the rise.
So the next question is about timing, really. So it's either, if you have an idea of it, you know, kind of the sweet spot for the lowest risk but the most effective bracken management, which I suppose is something we're almost trying to find out ourselves within the research. Or certainly kind of what's the lowest risk time of year, in your opinion?
It's interesting because if you look at the actual fact, it's the croziers, etc., that come out in the spring, they say, well, actually, that's the most risk period. But if you've got so much bracken plant to go at, you quite often find the majority of the toxin issues we see are either croziers in cattle at the spring period, or actual sort of at the end of the year, we tend to see actually towards the end of sort of the summer period. And there's certain areas where people have said never put cattle out on the bracken after about summer, after September time, because they know that's when they got the most toxin issues. And in those circumstances, that would suggest that actually what you're maybe not dealing with then is maybe so much an active plant, but maybe the die-off period, and they're just so desperate to forage, they're picking up so much, that's when the risks are. I think with all these things, I would probably spray spring and back end of the year, probably your two primary periods when we see the most diagnostics in terms of bracken toxicity. So those would be a risk period. But I then highlight the fact that individual animals are individual animals. If they develop a penchant and a taste for it, they will graze on it hard, and you're no better off. The pig cases we tend to see with the thiaminases, they always tend to see at the back end. Again, that's due to they're cumulative. They don't happen overnight. The death might, but they take time to knock out their B1 reserves and everything else. So pigs always seem to be at the back end in terms of instance.
So
Livestock.
when you're looking at those sort of cases, is it actually when it's the cumulative one? So it's been that summer, the kind of prolonged exposure over the summer sort of thing.
It is
That
for the
is resulting in it.
monogastrics. Yeah, the monogastrics are usually long term. A death from acute bracken is usually fairly straightforward. It's either going to be at the back end when they've got not an awful lot more to eat and a decent vast amounts of it, or at the beginning when they're eating rhizomes that are young calves, and basically they're looking for stuff that's quite small and doesn't involve a lot of work. So rhizomes and sort of like crosiers are quite easy to ingest, and if there's not much else out there, which is obviously what we're aspiring to with these programs, is to look at how much grass can we actually get into that area beyond the bracken itself, which is obviously what would be the preferential for most stock to eat. Pigs always at the back end. So thiaminase is that cumulative toxin effect. It basically, once it knocks out your B1s, and also once you're a bigger pig, you get more demand on your heart as well. Tends to tip you over the edge quite quickly.
Thank you. So one of the things that I think is worth mentioning at this point that we've built into the field lab particularly, and is kind of what we've been recommending based on the kind of the understanding of the risk and things anyway, is always to make sure you've got other feed available. Like the main kind of, I think, consideration here is that we don't want them to be eating it. Obviously, as Alan said, some animals are inclined to do it anyway, but we need to do our best to make sure that they've got plenty of other options so that they don't start eating that. So whenever you're thinking about designing kind of a management system that's looking at bracken management of livestock, do always consider how you're going to get alternative feed up there, whether that's supplementary feed with bales, whether it's hard feed, or whether it's making sure there's plenty of other grass, which obviously, depending on the site, isn't always available. So it's just things to think about. Not a question here, but just so everybody's aware, if you have a little look in the Q&A, the Foundation of Common Land have put the link in for the modern Lauper virus vaccine. So you can see that there. We'll share it around afterwards as well. Next question. To what extent can the impacts of bracken consumption by livestock be mitigated sorry, the screen moved when I was mid-reading. It's about supplemental feeding, so we've maybe covered it. Can this mitigate to the extent it allows to use livestock? Yes. Sorry, I feel like we've answered that question already. So we'll move on to the next one. This one is about kind of collecting bracken. So Lillian's dad always cut and baled bracken post-November after the first frost because he said it no longer green. When it's no longer green, does that reduce the risk, Alan? Does that make it a lot safer in terms of if it's around livestock?
I would be conscious to say if you're looking at it for livestock, i.e. ruminants, not horses. Horses have been known to get bracken toxicity, and thiaminases are permanent effect. The qualicide will reduce a little bit, but not that much. So for the drying process, it will help. But at the end of the day, the advocation is really not to use it in any means. We're not using it for bedding. And as such, therefore, we probably strongly advocate you shouldn't be using it for any sort of like forage system at all, for the simple fact that the toxin levels, they're unpredictable. And as such, therefore, with any of these things, yes, there might be less of it, but it doesn't mean they're still not sufficient to cause a problem. So the advice is don't use it in any way, other than I will say, as we are looking at in terms of a grazing system. We wouldn't be advocating it as a forage source, and certainly we don't advocate it as a bedding source. So
just an addition to that question that I'd heard in a previous webinar about people putting it into compost and stuff. How will that composting affect or do we know how that composting will affect the toxin level and stuff in terms of that then going into kind of a substrate for growing food?
the qualicide would break down, so it would break down over a time period, especially it doesn't like low pHs. Well, sorry, it likes higher pHs, so it doesn't like low pHs. So in terms of an actual chemical destruction, it would be quite effective depending on the length of time you put it into compost. So, but I can have a look at that one actually. It's a reasonable point to make. So yeah, I'll dig into that.
To one question about. You mentioned withdrawal periods. Can you just expand around that? So it was 4 days for milk and 15 days for meat.
Yeah, if you've got any animals that are lactating that you actually then use that milk from, the advice and guidance from Food Standards Agency is that that milk shouldn't be consumed from those animals until 4 days after they've been removed from source, i.e. this case, bracken. Same with meat. The premise of if you've got an animal that's going for slaughter, beef, sheep or pig, the idea and guidance is, again, those animals should be removed from the feed source, in this case bracken, for a period of 15 days before the animal is then slaughtered. So that's the guidance. It's no different from a milk withdrawal from an injectable product or an antibiotic, etc. Same principles. They all have withdrawal periods on them. So in this case, you've got to think of the bracken as an actual chemical you've administered to the animal, or a worm or parasiticide or anything, you've got a 15-day withdrawal from meat, 4 days from milk. The likelihood of having dairy cows out in the middle of a bracken environment is low, but that doesn't say actually maybe someone's got a house cow. So things to be considered.
Thank you. This maybe to come back to a little bit, but instead of about composting necessarily, it's about mulching. So this is somebody that cuts quite a lot of bracken that they mulch over 6 to 18 months to be spread on public access gardens. Does the mulching destroy the toxins? Should we be concerned about toxins leaching into watercourses, especially when cutting young plants?
Again,
and what's the risk to machinery operators is the additional part of that.
Again, all the exposure data we've got doesn't indicate any concerns whatsoever. So I think in terms of the actual water course, we know certainly we're looking at the toxin of Toxicology in this case, we're not looking at other ones. We know it's water solvent, but Environment Agency and various other bodies have looked at them, even in some runoff areas from bracken, and not found a level of public concern. So realistically, any actions you're taking should be minimal. But again, anything you've done to handle the product and then you actually put it into mulch, compost, etc., there would be a period of time by which point that toxin will have been obliterated and altered quite markedly. So there would be no perceived public risk. But I think with all these things, it's useful to have a little bit of a guidance in terms of what's a base minimum time period to have that activity done. So I will look into that and have a look, see if there's any advice and guidance been given. But I think these are the certain relevant aspects, because it's nice to know what people are doing with it and actually understand, well, does that, as I say, alter the risk to that subset of the population, etc. So all good questions, and I'll dig into those aspects in terms of the disposal of it, shall we say.
The next one, which might be more of a nutritionist question, but if you haven't answered that would be great. In supplementing pigs with normal pig ration, is that sufficient to manage the related thiamine deficiency, or do they need a specific supplement?
You'd need to look at the B1 levels that are in it and then consider the fact you've got a thiaminase in that feed, i.e. the bracken. You would then want to say, well, is it over a certain amount that's required? So quite often it's a case of daily live weight gain requirements are this, mineral and vitamin requirements are this. I would want to try and maybe sort of specifically tailor it a little bit to nutrition to say, well, look, I've got them on a diet which is utterly deficient on B1. How much should I give them? And at least if you're then giving them a sort of substantial amount of supplementation that's there, there's no hard and fast rule, because it all depends on how much thiamine you've got and thiaminase you've got in there to actually knocking out your thiamine resources. So therefore, you always want to probably give them more than what's in a conventional diet, because a conventional diet's based for a conventional pig. You've not got a conventional pig. You've got a pig that's on a diet which we know is already detrimental to its thiamine levels. So you definitely want to supplement them. But again, I would probably look to say, well, just how much thiaminase am I getting? Don't know. So how much thiamine do I need? I would look in terms of say, well, actually bump it up by a factor of 2 or 3 at the very least to make sure you're covering your bases, etc.
I hope that helps, Neil. In terms of obviously some deficiencies and stuff, and kind of you can look at blood tests to see kind of where you're at. Is B1 one that you can do? Because I know some of them it fluctuates so much that it's basically it doesn't mean anything one day to the next. Is it something that you could investigate that way if you were wanting to target that amount?
Good luck trying to get blood off a mangalitz in the middle of a fell. It'd be that for a kickoff. I would say no, because realistically you've got compartments here, and the measuring B1 is stored, so therefore it has a homeostatic level in the blood. So unless you've got to critical levels where it's so low, you can say, well, it's actually not in there anymore. You've probably got a pig that's already at the end stage of the problem. So monitoring it will be more of an issue. In these situations, it's probably the case to just be quite pragmatic and say, well, look, I know it's going to get the issue. What do I do to offset that? Stick extra B1 in. Then it might be a bit of an empirical formula you use in the first place, but I'd certainly be the way I would go. Trying to monitor it in terms of blood samples, you've got so many variables that's going to affect that B1 level in terms of drives, other nutritional factors. I don't think it's worth trying to measure it, because I think cost-wise alone, you guys all deal with NHS and you think it's free. Well, it costs a fortune to get some of these tests done. And if you're actually doing it from a private basis, which you would be in this case, it would actually be so expensive and prohibitive. I think it's easier just to give them B1. Job done.
Just to talk them up. Good stuff. So we've got a question here from Bill, who's one of our trialists. So he's been monitoring the browsing impact of the livestock and the bracken as his main strategy for assessing risk. I could just kind of keeping an eye on them. He hardly ever sees any signs of the cows taking it in. Do you think that's sufficient, basically?
Yeah, because I think what
if you're seeing no evidence of them eating it.
yeah, you could go out with a tea plate and measure every plant, but that's not going to be practical. So realistically, we use an awful lot of tech now in terms of videos and monitoring cows, and visual observation is fundamental, but you're not going to be doing that in the dark. You're not going to be doing it 24 hours a day. So realistically, it's a case of saying, well, how can I get a bit of an assessment of just how much the topography is changing that time period, offsetting for plant growth versus other factors. But I think realistically, any tool that you're using, if that even is just a pair of eyes to actually get an assessment as to what the cows are doing, is a useful aspect to it. And you're then fitting that in with all the other aspects of, well, has there got any other issues? Is it growing the right way? What's the condition doing? Is there any other clinical problems? And realistically, every piece of information you gather is useful in those circumstances. So no, I would say that it's effective enough, and we've not got to the point of maybe having a sort of drone take AI pictures and actually measure them by actual thing. But those are systems we're now looking at. We're using that in Australia to measure sheep numbers because it's impossible to count them. So they used to use AI on computers. So I mean, who's to say we couldn't use that going forward in terms of actual coverage? But yeah, visual expression, fine.
Yeah. The next one is, and I think it might differ depending on the livestock class. How effective are LITS supplements in preventing direct toxicity to grazing animals on bracken? Is B1 the only compound that is needed to supplement to counter the bracken effect? So obviously the B1 is very specific to monogastrics, therefore pigs in this topic.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's relevant for, is there anything else that's relevant for pigs, or is there anything that would be relevant to supplement for
no, because it's not a supplementation exercise per pig, apart from the B1 and the monogastrics. So realistically, everyone else is in excess of a toxin from the plant itself, which you're not going to give them anything to offset with. So realistically, there's nothing you could put out there that's going to, shall we say, mitigate the issues or the risks, shall we say. So no, I wouldn't say there is.
Thank you. So the next question is about, I suppose it's physical damage, refers to if bracken speared the stomachs. Is that actually, was that just a kind of basically what the hemorrhage is, that like the hemorrhaging, or do you see physical damage from the plant?
None of it. You can, well, cattle eat straw and all the rest of it on a regular basis without mechanical insults. No, the issue of all the damage is related to the fact that your bowels move all the time. So they're under continual movement. But because you've got no clotting ability, which is because your bone marrow has been wiped out, you have clots every day of the week. You just don't realize it because your body's in control. But in these cases, these guys have got no ability to clot. So what's normal movement creates hemorrhage. Now, invariably, you control that. But if you've got no ability to plug it, it just keeps on going and going and going, which is why you end up with these massive gross hemorrhages. Same with any disease that knocks out your clotting ability. Hemophilia in humans. What might seem like a normal bump of your arm as you go through a doorway, etc. You think, oh, that really hurt. I'll get a bruise tomorrow. If you're a hemophiliac, you'll end up with a football in your underarm within a couple of minutes. Same with these beasts as well. It's related to the fact you've got no red cells and no clotting ability. That's what it comes down to.
You. Everybody's started asking questions now. We got to this part. There's this one there, in a cut graze spray regime, if the bracken has been cut or sprayed first, is the regrowth less of a risk?
No, because the toxins are the toxins. They're not going to be altered by a chemical substrate, and they certainly don't alter the plant makeup to make it do anything different. So it's still there.
Unfortunately, not. Is the answer to that one. Is there any concern from the spores for bracken?
It's been mentioned, but realistically, because they will contain toxins, but at the end of the day, they're no different from any other toxic component you would see, but the volume and number of them is quite small. So it's never been perceived as a human problem, nor in livestock either, although it does indicate an additional stream, shall we say, of potential exposure. It's not considered to be a significant exposure route.
I think just in terms of adding some context, historically and in some kind of from a human health risk, people have often thought of spores as being quite risk because it's kind of the inhalation and stuff. But actually, and from something that Robin's mentioned in the past, that you see an incredibly small number of spores. That it's not a common sight. And when he's been working with bracken and stuff, it's obviously something he looks out for, and it's not something that he sees much of.
You're more likely at risk getting off the tractor with the diesel that's coming from it and all the fumes and particles from that than you are from the spores from the bracken.
So this question from Julia, whose pigs were on the video earlier.
Maggie's, yeah.
And I think I have maybe sent it to you, or I think I did send it to you previously. Would supplementing with willow help the B1 issue?
No, willow's B12 based in terms of the cobalt factor, so wrong bitumen.
So
Good noble
B1
idea,
that
but we use the willow more in terms of sheep premise, in terms of we've got a lot of sheep with pine B12 deficiency, and also the aspect it's meant to be good from a parasite control as well. But in terms of this particular challenge, no, that wouldn't be a benefit in this case, I'm afraid.
Not the right B.
No, wrong B.
Fair enough. Next question's more about soils. I believe that bracken brings up phosphorus from deep down, so using it as mulch or in a compost mix would be the best use for it as as phosphorus is finite. Is this a good idea? I suppose that comes back to the question about how the toxins break down and stuff, which you're going to follow up on.
It would do, but again, with the phosphorate aspect, you need to ask an agronomist, not my area, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. Next one. I suppose this is a bit more of a wider question. Has anyone tried controlling bracken, say in heathland conservation, with upturned scrap black buckets to deprive bracken crowns of sunlight in areas of rotation? The bracken plan. Not something I've heard of people doing, but if anybody has, please pop it in the chat or answer. I think whoever you'll be able to answer the questions as well, but please chuck it in. Last question we've got on here for now. What is your recommendation for the best mitigation strategy for cattle?
Sorry, what was that last one?
Best mitigation strategy for cattle.
To mitigate what? The risk of bracken, the risk of ticks? That would be the question. I mean, at the end of the day, the risk posed by bracken is well known, has been known for centuries in terms of the problems. I think at the end of the day, the measures that we're taking forward with regards to the primping and various other things of bruising, they're all very effective means, but I think a holistic approach, being aware of what the risks are, but in addition to that, using methods that are always been established with these field labs, etc., as to what works best and tailored for your individual circumstance. As we pointed out with your chap from Perthshire last time, if you've got a field full of rocks and bracken, you're not going to get all your machinery out there. So you need to be pragmatic about what you do, but you'll certainly get cattle out there. But realistically, if you're getting extra feed to them, you're foddering them, they've got additional bits of grassland, etc., then as the other chaps pointed out, you don't see them eating that much of it. It's not a plant that they will preferentially graze upon unless there's absolutely wholesale nothing else for them to take on. So you just need to be balanced in terms of using it. It's an area of grazing and land that we need to make use of, because at the end of the day, there's lots of other things out there that we can actually help with in terms of the biosphere, shall we say. But no, in terms of specific mitigation methods, other than don't put them on it, it's a case of managing it using the tools and methods that we have out there and just trying to reduce the risk of intakes. In that case of making sure they're getting fed properly or fed supplementary.
Thank you. Richard, your question about the buckets and stuff, there's a couple of people have put a response on there. So some people have used tin sheets. So there's a couple of answers on there if you want to have a look. Robin is online, so thankfully haven't misquoted him too aggressively. But just in terms of the spores, Robin's only seen them 3 times and he looks for it specifically. However, I've not spent a lot of time down south and it may spore more in warmer areas. But also Robin's up at James Hutton up in North Scotland, so he's a bit further away. I think just a couple of questions that I noted down before we got a huge amount through from everybody. So thank you for everybody for putting your questions forward. One was whether you could just, we had questions previously about tick acclimatization. So I think it's people that are kind of working in the uplands a lot and stuff, it's kind of this historic thing that you kind of climatize your livestock to tick. Can you explain that a little bit to kind of anybody that's either new into it or kind of new to putting cattle in that situation and stuff? Just tell a little bit what we're aiming for with that.
Yeah, it's not a perfect science, but the basic idea is what you're trying to do is trying to say to things, okay, we're going to put you out on here. You're going to develop disease for a period of time, but after that, if you survive, and that might seem a bit dark, you'll go over it. And your progeny will be better suited for it as well, because they'll be adapted to it. There'll be sort of a little bit of not necessarily much in cattle with transplacental protection, but you'll certainly get colostral protection for one or two of those pathogens. But in conjunction with that, it's an adaptation exercise. You basically, it's like humans evolve, other species evolve as well. So your body adapts to the challenges that are there and you become more tolerant of it. So if you go off to Africa and find that lots of people have got sickle cell anemia, it's great. It's not a good disease to have, but it avoids you getting malaria. Same principle with the cattle and sheep that we put onto these fields. They will still get ticks. They will still get exposed to these diseases, but their ability to fight it off, it's like an inheritable skill set. It basically means you're more suited to actually being in those environments. The problem being, you do need to be exposed to maintain that level of health. If you step away from it, and all of a sudden you go away to university for 5 years and you don't actually know how to live in the environment you were, same thing. So if you move these cattle away or these sheep away, it's the same as you're bringing in naive species. You say, oh, I've just seen this really good looking bull over and such and such. I want to bring him in because he's going to give me perfect calves. You bring him in, then he drops dead from sort of Redwater. So 6 weeks later, it's because he's just not suited for it. If you got a bull from down the road who's seen it all his life and never really been exposed to that trickle effect, he'll be quite happy to cope with it. Same with sheep as well. So it's a trickle effect, effectively, whereby you're getting exposed to something on a regular basis that builds your ability to fight it off, your innate immune system. And that's the principle. If you come in naive and you've never seen it before, you're far more vulnerable to getting disease. And those diseases might be far more effective in terms of impact on your overall health. So that's how the sort of, shall we say, the sensitization process works. And it goes generation. So you start off with one generation and they have to get it at some point, and that's where you try and make sure the dose is not that big, so therefore they get over it and survive. They'll then be in a much better position for their progeny to be better off as they go forward as well.
Yeah, great stuff. And actually, Bill's just said that's a good argument for having a closed flock and herd
Fundamental
from that point of view.
Mm.
My last one was just kind of more of a just for if anybody is worried about any of the various issues that have been mentioned today. How are they investigating / reporting into APHA? Is it straight through their vet and their vet will know what to do? What's the recommendation from that point of view?
Yeah, APHA has an involvement with this from a diagnostic side, and we obviously have veterinary investigation centres. If you're in Scotland, you SRUC. At the end of the day, that data is collected, but it needs to come through your private vet. So I can tell you all day long what I think you should do, but I'm not on your farm. I've never seen your farm before. And you need to have your vet on the farm because they have seen it. They know what's going on. They've walked those fields. They've seen that stock. They have a true picture of what's actually happening. I just get the blood sample, the skin scraper, the poo, invariably, in a bag, which says, can you find something in here? And realistically, the vet needs to make sure they're taking the right advice, but the vet needs to talk to us as well. So there's actually that dialogue for all three parties involved, yourselves, the vet, and the APHA. The people have a little bit more experience, shall we say, in what diagnostic tests to use. But your private vet's your first person to go to. We provide information and guidance, but it needs to go through your private vet in the first instance because they're getting the ability to talk to you on a more regular basis, and more importantly, they know what's going on, so they can get an overview.
Thank you. And thank you so much for that presentation. There's been a comment on here saying exceptionally good. There you go, Alan.
Won't go that far, but thank you very much. It's been, to be honest with you, any time to educate or learn something is important. Every day is a school day. At the end of the day, every opportunity to have a chat, give you some information as to what we know, and more importantly, ask questions. I've never had any thought about the mulching process and everything else. So every chance is actually at the stimulus. Thank you very much for that. So it's a two-way street. So grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I've just got a couple of slides left to go just to finish this off. So we have gone over slightly on that Q&A, but that was partly my fault. So that's fine. But this last little bit is just about, gone to your slides. Where I asked it to start from. Do all your lovely pictures again. Here we go. Right, so the last little thing that I just wanted to mention today was about the Learning Network. So some of you may be on here already because you've already signed up for the network. Wonderful, thank you. We'll send the link around in the follow-up email and stuff as well, but I have got a QR code at the end. This map just shows the spread of people that we've got involved already. So this is everybody that's signed up already. And you can see that we go right from one end to the other. It is UK-wide. I haven't got anybody in Northern Ireland yet. So if you've got any contacts there that you think actually would be interested in this, please do pop it across to them. And really what we're creating is an opportunity for all this knowledge sharing, as we've seen just on the Q&A there. If you've got a question about wanting to try something, there's a good chance there's people already in the group that have tried it. So it's that sort of conversation. It's things like access to people like Alan and other experts like Robin and stuff. So there's lots of learning opportunities, and there's additional research opportunities as well. In terms of what we've kind of got so far from the feedback from everybody, the next bit of the research is likely still to be on this livestock aspect of it. This is the result so far. As you can see, 85% of people are still interested in that grazing, trampling, and knowing more information. Obviously, there's been a lot of mechanical stuff, so it still will be a topic we'll talk about. By no means we won't look at it, but it's just what this research focus is going to be on. So an additional field lab, essentially. When we've dug down into kind of the specific wants of people in terms of the grazing, trampling aspect of it, there's been quite a lot of interest regards kind of stocking densities, like how many animals do we need to kind of make an impact, and what the timeline is on that and stuff. So it's likely that that's going to be where the question lands. If anybody thinks that they've got a setup where they can be part of that field lab, please do get in touch. We'll monitor a couple of other things as well, like we have with the current one. Particularly often that biodiversity question is still really interesting, and we want to see what impact we're having in terms of that side of things as well. But please do make sure you'll get another opportunity to be part of it. But it is likely that that's the question we're going to go for. In terms of how we're delivering for the Learning Network, again, by the numbers today, it's been pretty obvious, but the webinars have been really kind of popular in terms of what people want to see. So we will keep doing webinars. I think there'll be at least 2 webinars a year for the next kind of 3 years, but probably also 2 in-person events as well. So we'll try and move those around the area. They're not going to be accessible for everybody, but we will move them across the UK for that farm walk side of things. And anything we can do in terms of technical resources, we will provide, because I think that kind of reassurance is really what people want. So this is the QR code and also the email address for the Learning Network. So please use those if you are that way inclined tech-wise, or we'll send a link out afterwards. I think a chunk of you already know, but one of the things about this, and one of the reasons I want you to use that email address, is that I actually go on maternity leave at the end of March. So I'm handing this over to a very capable person, but I will have to hand it over a little bit. So please make sure that you sign up through those routes. And if you've got any questions, if you send it to that email address, that will be continued to be monitored after I go on leave. And then I'll be back in time to do some more stuff next year. So I think that is the end of my slideshow. We've got 1 minute left. Very pleased with myself that. We've got a couple of more questions that are not questions, lots of thank yous have popped up. So thank you for that, everybody. And yeah, like I said earlier, if you have any other questions that come into your brain once you've had a chance to kind of mull over what's been said, or if you want to watch any of the presentation back, and that's giving you more questions, please do send them over to us. Alan struggles to get away from me at the best of times, so I will ask the questions of him and get back to everybody. Because we work together at Morden, not because I stalk him. He is safe from me. But otherwise, I just want to express my thanks for everybody coming online, and yeah, that's us finished. So thank you very much.